When I was at school and thinking about what I wanted to do at university, I think I was very interested by politics and my political views and society, interested in people in the world around me. Looking back, I think I had a silly view that if I could only take a degree in social sciences, then I would have so much evidence to back up my political views that when I was arguing about politics with my friends and down the pub and so forth, I would know so much about it, I would be able to show to people that my political views were correct. Of course, which is nonsense. And I found out that the more I did know, insofar as these things are knowable, I found it was far more complex, problematic than I thought. Science, in most circumstances, is the best way of answering the question, how? Why should you do it? Science can't answer that question. If you don't have an acceptable notion of what you should do, why you should do it, then the how is a lesser question.
Hello, Hugh McLachlan. Welcome along to Cali Corner. I really appreciate you coming in here today to help me record this.
Hello, Paul. Thank you.
No worries. So, Hugh, you were a professor of philosophy for a long time here at Glasgow Caledonian University.
Yeah, specifically applied philosophy.
Right, okay, we can get into what that is, because I've got no idea. And I thought it'd be interesting to sort of speak to you, just because I'm interested in philosophy as a subject myself, just to sort of learn a wee bit more about it. And there's some topical stuff that's going on from sort of legislative perspective at the moment, which I think would be interesting to speak to somebody who's, taught and is interested in philosophy as well.
That'd be good, yeah.
What got you into philosophy, Hugh? Like, what's the backstory?
Well, I suppose the start was when I was at school and thinking about what I wanted to do at university. I think I was very interested by politics and my political views and society, interested in people in the world around me. And looking back, I think I had the silly view that if I could only take a degree in social sciences, then I would have so much evidence to back up my political views that when I was arguing about politics with my friends and down the pub and so forth, I would know so much about it, I would be able to show to people that my political views were correct. Of course, which is nonsense. And I found out that the more I did know, insofar as these things are knowable, I found it was far more complex, problematic than I thought. But I was very interested in the subject, the sociology and political economy at Glasgow University. And I went on to do a PhD in the philosophy of social sciences. And the thing is, when you're that far down the line, even although really I don't recall puzzling too much of what I was going to do for a living thereafter, I was just interested in the subjects. And by the time you've got so much time and effort invested in the academic line, then you tend to be propelled down that way.
What is philosophy, Hugh? Like, I find myself Googling this every other year, and I think I change my answer on this all the time. Could you give us a layman's understanding? Or?
I would say this. One thing that makes philosophy so difficult to define is that you might say, when you're giving a definition of philosophy, actually you're doing philosophy. But if you give a definition, say, of physics, you're not doing physics when you give a definition of physics. And I think a feature of philosophy is that there's more than one possible answer, and rational people might have rational reasons for disagreeing. I would say the best way to think of what philosophy is to think of what philosophy isn't. And I would start with the idea that all questions about what the world is like, how we understand it, how we explain it, how we gain knowledge of it, all questions of that sort are philosophical. Let's start with that as the subject. All such questions are philosophical. Now, with some range of such questions, we get scientific studies of them. And with scientific studies, we have agreed ways of answering these questions. And once we have agreed ways of, say, answering, say, questions about optics, let's say, then optics becomes science. You become a science when certain things are knowable and there are certain agreed methods of finding the answer. Then, and you get a community of people studying such things, and you get an accumulation of knowledge. What somebody finds out is written down, people can come along and add to it or change it. And once you get other people to test your own views, evaluate your views, they can refine them, and they can produce evidence to substantiate them. Once you get a body of knowledge about particular areas, then they cease to be philosophical questions. They become, say, chemical questions, or say, optics questions, or dermatological questions. And I think that leaves us with these philosophical questions, which they do have this feature that you can't really answer them without doing philosophy, which in a sense means you're never going to quite get there as any definitive answer. This is categorized, we see something like this. I mean, say there was a dispute about what the highest mountain in the world is. Now, and there might well be a dispute, but you might also say, oh, well, these things change over time. I mean, maybe for all I know, there's slippages possibly. And let's say there's a dispute among people who study such things about what the highest mountain was. Well, although they might well disagree about what the highest mountain was, they would agree about how you would find out. So they might start off with a disagreement, but they would start off as well with an understanding and an agreement on what sort of tests would answer the question. What sort of procedures would settle the matter, even if only temporarily until some other dispute. And questions like that, say, they're not philosophical questions. They are scientific questions. And let's say the rest, when we're trying to understand, gain knowledge of what's going on, or in any field, potentially, they are philosophical questions. So it doesn't quite nail what they are, but it gives a kind of way you can point at them.
Aye. Well, that's it. Like, when I think about it, I just think, like, the questions that I think the big question is, like, what's the meaning of life? It's open to interpretation, right? And everybody's got a different answer for that.
Yeah.
Philosophy to me is that search for wisdom.
Yeah.
And you could probably ask yourself loads of different questions to try and get to the answer. What is the meaning of life?
I mean, I agree entirely. I mean, some people think that philosophical questions, they're the most kind of airy-fairy ones, the sort of trivial ones. I take the opposite view. I mean, I think that the basic question is, how ought we to live?
How what, sorry?
Sorry, how ought we to live?
How ought we to live?
How ought we to live? What should we do? Now, in a sense, an important sense, if you can't have an answer to that question, even a vague answer, which is fine, or an implicit answer, I mean, what's the point in doing anything?
That's the thing, everybody's got a different answer to that question, haven't they?
Science is important in telling us how to do things. If we want to do such and such, then science, in most circumstances, is the best way of answering the question, how? But why should you do that? Science can't answer that question. And they're the important questions, because if you don't have an acceptable notion of what you should do, why you should do it, then the how is a lesser question. So I would say that it's not a case of science is the main thing, the most important thing, and these philosophical questions. And I agree entirely with the ones that you've suggested. It's not that they're less important. No, they're They're the main ones.
I don't think I would disagree with you there.
And the other ones, if anything, if we want to describe some as more important than others, I would say the philosophy deals with the most important ones. And with I mentioned the idea of applied philosophy. Now, I would define applied philosophy as taking questions that we deal with anyway. Some questions are thrown up by philosophy, and they're questions that only philosophers ask. And that's fair enough. But like, what is the nature of philosophy? People in their everyday life don't think about that at all, if much. But there are some questions which we do think about. Really, how ought we to live? People implicitly ask that question, or implicitly act as if they had an answer. Now, what philosophy does is it can look at these matters more systematically, more rationally, we hope. And within my range of applied philosophy, among the areas, in fact, the area that's interested me the most is medical ethics. Now, that's the case that you're looking at questions that they're not made up by philosophers. They're not questions that only philosophers deal with. No, we all ask such questions. And while philosophy can't answer them in quite the way that scientists can answer scientific questions, I think it can help. At least it can give more satisfying answers to the people who raise the questions. It can give the best version or better versions of what we think. And sometimes when we look more carefully at particular questions, particular arguments, simply spending time looking at them sometimes gives us an answer that we end up being happier with. Of course, sometimes we end up with that we thought we had an answer and we end up not being sure of an answer, but at least it rationally lifts things up a level or two.
Aye, well, that is very topical then, the subject of medical ethics, because there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment, the sort of assisted dying bill, I believe they're calling it at the moment.
Yeah.
So I'm sure this is a subject that you would be interested in sort of debating. Like, what is your stance on the topic of changing the legislation there?
In principle, I think we should definitely look at the matter, and in principle, I'm very keen on the possibility of an acceptable law. But I have my reservations about the proposed one at the moment. I mean, some people talk about the proposed bill being the thin end of the wedge. Well, that's my problem with it. I think it's too thin. I want the thick end of the wedge here. I think it's too narrow a view of the matter. I think to think of, well, I prefer just to talk about assisted suicide. If somebody's assisted suicide, to regard it as a matter merely for those people who know that they are terminally ill and only have a short time to live. To restrict the scope of the bill merely to them, it's far, far too narrow. I think that we should consider the feasibility of having legislation concerning assisted suicide for whatever people's reason. And we shouldn't think of it as primarily a medical matter. It's not merely for a medical reason that some people might want to have assistance in killing themselves. Now, we might not be able to imagine what these various reasons are, but that's none of our business. We can imagine that there might be such reasons. And to say that it's only those people who have the prospect of a specifiable medical a medical condition that's going to kill them soon. No, it's not just them. In fact, what about people who realise they might soon get a terminal illness and they want to kill themselves before they reach that stage? I mean, after all, if you get 6 months to live, 6 months of unbearable pain is quite a lot of pain. And people might well be able to benefit from at least the thought that they never need to reach that stage. And I think that a lot of the objections to it are actually trivial. I mean, this might sound rhetorically convincing, like people who are ill or disabled, feeling pressurised into committing suicide if assisted suicide becomes legalised. Well, I think that's nonsense. I mean, I think if that was a reason, it would be a reason against legalised suicide. Never mind legalised assisted suicide. I think that there are pressures in life that are, including the thought that people might be a burden on other people. Well, the thing is, people can be a burden on other people. And it's inappropriately patronising to say that people shouldn't be allowed to think they're a burden. People realise they're a burden. They're not merely a burden. I mean, just as children are a burden, babies are a burden. No, they're not merely burdens, and we don't treat them merely as if they were burdens. But when people become ill, and not only when they become ill, for other reasons, people can be burdens. And if the possibility of assisted suicide somehow made these people feel uncomfortable in thinking they were burdens and thinking that gave them a reason for committing suicide, well, I think that legalisation of suicide itself would count as a reason. But that's no reason for making suicide a crime again, as it used to be, paradoxically. Okay? And I think that we should give serious consideration to letting anyone, any adult, not for children, any adult having the possibility of getting assistance to commit suicide. Because after all, unless you have knowledge of medicine and the human body, it might not be that easy to commit suicide. But you want to you don't want to try to commit suicide and make a mess of it and end up in a worse position than you were before you tried. And I think that it would be worth thinking about legalising the situation where people can have access to aid to help themselves. And as I say, that it's too narrow just to look at it, terminally ill people.
Well, let's start there then, Hugh,
yes.
Because like my take on it is, well, there's a couple of things I wanted to speak to you about just before I forget. So I didn't realise that it used to be illegal to
commit suicide.
So it'd be interesting to talk about that in slower time, like when the law changed there and how that maybe impacted, people's attempts at sort of doing this. So we could discuss that. And then secondly, but being too narrow, like I disagree with that personally. Like there's a reason why this hasn't been implemented sort of earlier. I think there was probably loads of objections around, like you're saying, people feeling like they're being coerced into it, like it's going to help their sort of family. There's maybe pressure, subtle pressure that you maybe can't see. So why not just restrict it to people who literally only have like a few months to live and have been diagnosed by sort of multiple doctors at that point that the prognosis is terminal. I think that's a reasonable approach to take. The old saying is, don't walk before you can run, right? I feel like that's a sensible sort of first step for me anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think to answer the last question first, I think the reason for no... Well, I mean, I think I probably, if I had a chance to vote on the present one, I would probably vote yes. Though I would prefer if they were discussing a more general approach to assisted suicide, I think the thing is, once you've got a law, although people talk about slippery slopes and so forth, no, it's very difficult to look at something in a very narrow way and then later look at it in a very broad way. I think it would fix the situation for a long, long time. It would be difficult to go back and look at it more broadly. And I forgot your first point again.
I was interested in. I personally didn't realise that it used to be illegal.
Yes. Suicide used to be a criminal offence.
So when was that from until? And what was the impact of that?
I can't remember exactly. I can't remember the times. A couple of centuries ago. I think that the problem was that if you committed suicide, it just caused all sorts of legal problems for your reputation, for your descendants, your family. You couldn't be you couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Didn't apply to all religions, but certain branches of Christianity, and I think other religions as well. You wouldn't be buried in a cemetery, or not the sacred place of the cemetery, and this caused problems for your family, and it also caused problems thinking about it, because suicide might have been a way to give people release from an unbearable burden, and they didn't take that route because they didn't want to cause problems for those that they were left behind. And in terms of the reasons used, part of it were religious reasons. Now, the same arguments that we get now, I think baseless arguments, really. I think that those people who are religious and use religious objections, those people who are religious and don't approve of the legalization of anything, you can find religious reasons, just as those who are in favour of legalizing suicide and assisted suicide can find religious reasons. It's not essentially a religious matter, and I think some of the reasons given are just simply bad philosophy. David Hume wrote an article on an essay on suicide, and in it, what he took religious objections to suicide, and what he tried to show, I think successfully, was that within religion and within religious arguments, they weren't convincing as religious arguments. It wasn't a case of they weren't convincing arguments because religion is not convincing. From a religious point of view, they weren't good arguments. For instance, one argument given was that life is a gift from God. Therefore, we shouldn't commit suicide. Well, I think it's a bad argument. I mean, for a start, you might say, well, if life was a gift from God, we shouldn't commit suicide. Well, maybe morally we shouldn't, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be. That doesn't mean it should be illegal. Morality and law are quite different. The justification for having a law is not the same as the reason why particular acts are immoral. Some actions are not inherently immoral, but will make them crimes. Like smuggling. There's nothing inherently immoral about carrying a bottle of wine or whiskey from one country into another country. But you make it a crime, and that's a good reason for making it a crime. But it's just a difference there. But in terms of the idea that life is a gift from God, well, I believe life's a gift from God. Yes, but it doesn't follow that because life is a gift from God, we should never commit suicide. So someone will hurt God's feelings. This doesn't make sense in terms of the logic of a gift. I mean, suppose you said to somebody, I'm going to give you a gift of, let's say, a pair of trousers, and you must never take them off. Or I'll invite you to my party. When it comes to a party, it's a gift. And you see it becomes late at night, you decide you want to go home. You might say, look, thank you very much. I enjoyed the party very much, but I want to go home. Say, no, you can't go home. This was a gift. You must never stop utilising the gift. No, in fact, the gift is a gift from God. Yes, a gift from God. I mean, there's nothing illogical or contradictory or inconsistent with saying it's a gift from God, for which we're very grateful, but I've had enough. Thank you very much. And if everything is a gift from God, well, or things are a gift from God, we choose what's a gift and what's not a gift. Well, life was a gift from God. We've enjoyed it very much. But it comes to the circumstances perhaps where the gift of a way out of this pain and suffering will be very welcome. And there's nothing irreligious about that. We need to give it let's give it an actual religious picture. See the crucifixion. Let's say someone has been crucified. Maybe a number of people have been crucified. Now, it was a practice to break the legs of people being crucified at some point. And apparently, this was because when you're crucified, you spend the time going between the agony of having the weight of your body on your wrists and the horrible pain sensors in your wrist. And when you could bear that no more, you put the weight on your feet. Mm-hmm. So you had a seesaw motion there. And when your legs were broken, you couldn't put the weight back on your feet and you asphyxiated. So breaking the bones of people who were being crucified, breaking the legs of people being crucified, was a way of bringing their life to an end. Now, suppose that somehow we were in a situation where people were in intense agonies and apparently just the pain involved is just beyond all imagination of just how uncomfortable this is. Now, suppose somebody says, I'm going to break the legs of that person. If a religious person says, no, that person's life was a gift from God. We must never end it. I think it's perfectly in line with any religious thought that would seem to me to be worth the name. That to break the person's legs and to bring the agony to an end, it's not only morally acceptable. I think it might be morally what to do if we could in these circumstances.
I would like to think we would be crucifying people in the first place. That would be my take on the subject. But there's loads in there. Obviously, like is it no? I'm having to go back into the depths of my early Catholic religion here, but is the religious argument that you enter purgatory? Like if you commit suicide, then your soul is like trapped here forever as well. Like is that no part of the religious objections?
It might be to some people's test. It might be to some people's religious objections, and I would say that is not a reason for the law making a distinction there. The law and religion, the law and morality, these things are different. And for the law, especially in a country where there are all sorts of different religions and none, to have the law based on such a distinction, I think would be wrong. And ban religion as well. I mean, I don't see anything. Well, in Christianity, which I know more than other religions, there's nothing in Christianity that I see that either says or logically implies that sins should we should change the law so that sins become crimes. That's not. It doesn't follow. I mean, when Christ says, "Give to Caesar what Caesar's, give to God what's God's," which seems to, well, you can interpret that in different ways, of course, but it seems to me to imply the civil law is one thing, politics is one thing, morality is another thing, and religion is another thing altogether. But we started by suggesting that philosophical questions, whether their very nature, are questions to which reasonable people can reasonably disagree. And there's no one definitive answer. And there's no test we can conduct here, no experiments of any sort which will settle the matter. And that question that we've discussed there is one that fits the idea of a philosophical question.
Well, this is, I think, the third time that they've brought a bill of this nature to the Scottish Parliament. And the Parliament's only been there for 20 years or whatever it is. So it's a difficult one. I think I sort of go back and forward on it personally. I'm certainly not in favour of what you're advocating anyway. I must disagree with you there. I disagree. I think that.
But let's be clear. What I'm saying is, I think we should talk about that. I think that in Parliament, that'd be a good thing to talk about. Now, what the conclusion would be, what the law would be, well, there might not be a law. It might not be that we can devise and pass a law which would be acceptable. I agree with that. I'm not sure that there could be, but I'm just saying that in principle, I think that's one thing we should look at.
Yeah, if I think my perception of that would be that if they start debating that people will just go, "This is like going to open the floodgates. I'm totally uncomfortable with this," and then it would then sway people more to go towards going, "You know what? I don't actually support assisted dying anymore, or assisted suicide, as some people are calling it, because they think that the scope would creep. The scope would creep effectively into areas that you're talking about, and that would be make people apprehensive and anxious."
Yeah. Well, let's see how the debate goes. There might be other arguments that came out too. I mean, I don't think for a moment, suggest for a moment, that I know all the possible arguments. Another reason for throwing it open. Right? But another thing about the way, well, I think this might be covered to an extent. I don't think we need to involve doctors. I think that's a mistake. And I certainly don't think we should involve the NHS. There shouldn't be something to get on the NHS. I think for a variety of reasons. Some practical, comparatively trivial, and some more matters of principle. I mean, one thing is, the NHS is not so great at what it's doing at the moment. The thought of giving it more to do, given there's always an opportunity cost with these things, seems to me to be unwise. Another thing is, there's no need for doctors here. Now, I mean, after all, in the past, we executed people, but we didn't get doctors to do it. We didn't say if only doctors are allowed to execute people. No, there were specialists, non-medical people who were involved there. Now, we might look at the doctors to give suggestions of ways to do these things with the knowledge of how, but they don't need to do it. So there's no particular reason for doctors to do it.
Is that you looking for a new career here, Hugh?
No, I wouldn't like to do it. I'd be too squeamish. So we don't need doctors to do it. And in terms of the unease that people might have about it, and the thought of the suggested slippery slopes and feeling uneasy about it, I think, well, at least some of these worries would go if it was nothing to do with doctors. You see, I mean, if they become ill and go to hospital, and it's in their mind that the NHS does not only does healing people, but it does assisted suicide, they might feel, wait a minute, they might want to bump me off for cost-cutting reasons. I mean, they might have fears like that. Well, keep doctors in the NHS out of it. That helps to solve that. I mean, plus, it's not a medical treatment. I mean, assisted suicide is not a medical treatment. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's not a medical treatment. We want to kill ourselves if we do when medical treatments are no longer required and appropriate. So I think as far as possible, keep the medical profession out of it.
It's an interesting one. I haven't actually thought about that until you mentioned it there. So I could see how that would make people, it would expose a bit of paranoia, I suppose, if you were visiting, the hospital, if that was like a thing.
Yeah.
But I think they're saying that it's going to have to be signed off by more than one doctor.
But why the hell that? I mean, what's the doctor got to do with it? If somebody decides that they want to commit suicide, what's the doctor to say?
They're the ones who are making this is a terminal diagnosis. I think that's it. And then, like you're saying, you mentioned it earlier when we were talking about suicide, that, it was illegal because before people wouldn't have the knowledge about how to sort of do it. That information wasn't widely available. So we're putting it in the sort of wheelhouse in the medical world because we're sort of trusting that if somebody is terminally ill, then doctors will have they'll know the most humane way to, terminate somebody's life.
They can tell people, put it on the internet or something, I mean, I don't know what the procedure would be. Presumably some sort of medication of some sort. Medication may be the wrong word in the context. Some chemicals of some sort, to which only certain people in certain circumstances should have access to.
I feel like it would just be so open to abuse then. Like, how are you going to distribute it to them? How are you going to make sure that it goes to the person that's intended to take it and all that sort of stuff?
I agree. There's these practical matters, however, like with knives or anything that can be used to kill people. You've got to watch.
I'll be looking for weapons about here again. I feel you've got me nervous.
Yeah, but I mean, I agree with you. I think in principle we should consider the possibility of more wide-ranging legislation, but whether the consideration should lead to the decision to have such legislation and what such legislation would be, I don't know. And maybe there's no such legislation that would be appropriate. I mean, I agree with that.
So in the absence of that, just to put you on the spot then, if you were sitting in Holyrood and it comes to the vote and they say, we're going to change the legislation, and it is as it's sort of being proposed at the moment, I think, is if two doctors say you've got 3 months to live and we can terminate your life and there'll be no legal consequences for making that decision, would you be in favour of changing the law? Yes or no?
I would have to say yes. But it is marginally better than the situation at the moment.
I've seen this argument, and people are saying that we have palliative care just now, but I don't think there's an option there to terminate somebody's life. I think they just help to, this is my understanding. I don't know a lot of people have went through this, unfortunately, or I would not have wished death on anybody, but, I think they just manage the sort of your transition. I don't think they don't expedite it, I suppose, is kind of be the argument there.
I think the idea that that medication can remove all pain, I think that's just a fallacy. It's the thing that it can maybe reduce some pain, but not all pains can be reduced. Problem is, not all pains are medically caused. I mean, somebody might be in great misery because maybe his wife's dead. Maybe he's been married to his wife a long, long time. Maybe he's very old, but might have before him, for all he knows, the prospect of years in misery, and just has had enough and wants to go. Now, it's not a medical pain. There's no way you can give well, maybe there is, but that's as far as I know. There's no way you can give a pill to make the person feel happy. That would be appropriate. Now, sometimes misery is appropriate. If your wife is just dead, then in a sense, strange thing to say, but you should be miserable. Happiness isn't appropriate. But sometimes the misery can be too much, but only the person involved can say. But it's not necessarily something that a doctor can do anything to cure.
Mm.
I mean, plus, what about situations where people are locked in situations where they're conscious, but they can't, they can't move. Let's say that maybe they can say a few, maybe they can communicate, and that's all they can do. Suppose that was all they could do. You can maybe type, moving your eyelids or something like that. You can communicate some thoughts. And what you knew was that you weren't going to get any better. But you might well be in that situation for years and years and years. Now, we're saying that there should be no way out for that person. What if that person says, look, I'm absolutely miserable and I can't, all I can do is flash my eyelids. Please stop this for me. No, I think of a situation like that, we should at least consider.
It's very difficult.
We should consider why we should say, no, sorry, come back and ask us when you've only 6 months to go. That seems to me, that's just like a sick joke. I mean, it's
it's a hard one.
Well, it's a difficult one. Yes.
Same with like, I think I don't know if this is politically correct or no, whatever, it's a discussion. Like, I've always sort of I grew up with my few family members with dementia.
Yeah, same here.
And it's really debilitating, really difficult, really such a horrible disease. And I've sort of speculated, if that was to ever happen to me, like, it doesn't seem like a good quality of life,
Yeah.
And it's obviously no terminal.
Yeah.
It's just a kind of deterioration in your mental faculties, and I wouldn't fancy it personally, but I also wouldn't want to put myself in the position to say, right, you've got a decision, if that happens to me, that, I can go down this assisted suicide route,
Oh no, I don't think your son. I don't think anyone should have the decision. I think you can't consent for someone else. You can't, and sometimes notionally the law acts as if you can, but you can't. I mean, you can't say to somebody, look, you can have sex with my daughter or my son. You can't. For instance, consent can only be given by the person concerned. And dementia is a horrible case there.
Is that not what happens with dementia, though? Like, is that medical consent goes from, the person who's got the disease to their next of kin?
Notionally, yeah. And it shouldn't do, because you can't consent for them. I mean, somebody's got to make a decision. So it goes on, but it's wrongly called consent. I mean, you can no more consent to treatment, medical treatment, than you can consent, say, to your vote. I mean, you can decide the person would have voted, whatever. I think consent is a personal thing. The horrible thing about dementia is that once you have dementia, well, certainly a certain extent of it, you can no longer give consent because you're not in the mental capacity to give consent. And I think one thing that I haven't actually mentioned, I think should be stressed here, is that the thing about the possibility of legalised assisted suicide, it's on the premise that it's voluntary, that the person asks for it, and the person asking for it is of sound enough mind to give consent. And the horrible thing with dementia, no. So once you start it, I don't see how you can give. I don't see how you can. You'll be able to use any legislation there concerning assisted suicide to help, because I think it must be voluntary. It must be given with consent.
Yeah, I think that's part of this draft, whatever it is, this round one, the legislation that they've got that, like, they're factoring that into the equation. It's like the doctors are going to be trained to look out for, if someone is being coerced effectively into saying, I would like to.
But what is coercion? I mean, it's difficult to know that there's no.
It'll be difficult to spot subtle conversion.
Well, that's right.
Coercion, but there'll be examples, where somebody's been, let's say, in a domestic abuse sort of situation.
Yeah, but there's lots of that. I mean, we don't need special law. I mean, if you coerce somebody into committing suicide, well, there's laws against that, and you might say that these laws are maybe not very effective. Well, how can we get more effective laws? I mean, what counts as coercion? But you might persuade somebody. You might persuade somebody that there's a good reason for them committing suicide. Well, there might be a good reason for them committing suicide. And what counts as unfair persuasion is very difficult for the law to take a view there, I think.
It's not easy.
And we've got this, and the same issues apply with suicide. They're not fresh issues with assisted suicide. They're issues with suicide. You can, and it might often be reason. I mean, there might be someone who's thinking about committing suicide and doesn't want to do it. Now, someone might persuade somebody that actually these objections which the person has to committing suicide are not good objections. Like they might say, well, God is not going to be offended, let's say. Now, somebody might say, well, that's coercion. Well, it's not coercion if you think that that's actually a good argument, and that someone is refraining from committing suicide because of arguments against it that are bad arguments. Like somebody might think, I don't want to commit suicide because my sons and daughters will be horrified. Now, maybe they wouldn't be horrified. What even of a situation where purely mundane terms, and this crops up, psychological related to inheritance tax, let's say. They say somebody, I said, a good life, great life, lovely life, but for various reasons, has had enough. And realises that very soon, the only life available is going to be one with constant care, 24-hour care and attention, and only to experience an existence that's not attractive in the prospect, maybe extremely unattractive. And the prospect is that they might have such an existence for years and years and years. And the only certain prediction is that this is going to cost an awful lot of money. And let's say that you could easily knock up £500,000, more than £500,000. Let's say the person said, look, rather than spending time in that condition with constant care and attention and not much fun, no fun at all perhaps, the person might say, well, I would rather leave that £500,000 to my daughter, to my son. I would rather do that than live that existence with all that money being spent. Now, I don't think that's an irrational or an unusual thing to think. I mean, somebody might well think that. Now, why shouldn't the person think that? I mean, why shouldn't the person act on that basis?
But there's nothing to stop them acting that out just now.
Just commit suicide now.
Yeah, that's right. It's just that we're saying as a society we're not comfortable with helping, and I think that's a reasonable position.
It makes a difference. It does make a difference. I agree. I agree. I suppose there is the question of having the physical means to kill yourself, and the knowledge of how to do it, and the ability to get access to the medication or whatever. I mean, I suppose sometimes you need help for that.
Yeah.
So you might need help for that, and you might well be in a position where you're physically and mentally just not able to do that, but able to consent and able to experience great pain. I mean, I think the capacity to suffer great pain keeps going long after the capacity to enjoy any aspect of life is gone. The capacity for great pain remains.
It sounds like you're describing being a Scottish national fan now.
Well, that wasn't specifically in my mind, but yes, that's what it could be. Yes.
What about quite a heavy sort of subject matter there, Hugh? So maybe take you on to some like your other sort of areas of interest. I understand you've written some books about witchcraft. Like, is it Scottish witchcraft in particular?
Scottish witchcraft in particular, yes. Yes.
Is there anything that you love? Like, have you got a favourite like anecdote or a favourite story that you've researched over time? Like, what should the public in Scotland know about witchcraft? What would you love them to know?
I think one thing I want them to know is fake news. Fake news is not a new thing. There was a book published in the 1590s, and it was called News from Scotland, just to make it even more appropriate. It was called News from Scotland.
Right.
And it told the story, published in London, this book, News from Scotland. And it told the story of the trial of various people for witchcraft. In particular, John Fian, also known as John Cunningham. And he was tried at the High Court and found guilty and executed. And it says in News from Scotland, it gives an account of the evidence used against them, including this story. That gather my thoughts slightly, to get the details here. I haven't thought of this for a long, long time. But part of the story was this, that he was a school teacher, and it was said that he was attracted to one of his female pupils, and that he asked another of his pupils, who was the brother of this girl, to do a number of things for him. And one of the things was he asked the pupil to pluck one of his sister's pubic hairs. Apparently, in those days, it wasn't uncommon for siblings to sleep in the same bed, so lack of accommodation and so forth. Because the school teacher wanted to do some witchcraft on this. But the pupil was unsuccessful in his attempts because his sister kept waking up and objecting to this attempt to pluck some pubic hair. And the mother became aware of the boy's attempts, and she became suspicious. So the school teacher had threatened to thrash the boy unless he performed this. Well, the boy was thrashed anyway by his mother, who demanded to know what he was up to, and he mentioned the school teacher. So what the mother then did was she plucked hairs from the udder of a cow, and gave them to the schoolboy, and the schoolboy was told to give them to the school teacher, which he duly did. And it says in News of Scotland that the part of the evidence against John Fian was that when he walked through the town of, I think it was near Linlithgow, I think, somewhere near Edinburgh, he said when he walked through the town, he was pursued by a lovesick cow who had been caught up in the school teacher's attempt to catch magic. The cow fell in love with the school teacher and followed the school teacher through the town. And it was said in News from Scotland that this was part of the evidence used in the High Court. Rubbish. It was made up. That story was totally made up, but presented in News from Scotland as fact. And it was interwoven with accounts of the trial of John Fian, which are quite accurate. And it was true that he was tried for witchcraft, and the various elements of the evidence used were quite accurately reflected. But this story was made up and thrown in. And I think it was specifically made thrown in because this was round about the time of the.
Which parts of it were untrue?
Sorry.
Which parts of the story were untrue?
Oh, about the school teacher, about the teacher asking the boy to get the pubic hair of his sister.
So that never happened.
No, no, it's not mentioned in the High Court. It's not mentioned anywhere. So I presume it's totally made up. Yes. It's certainly false to say it was in the High Court records, which the News from Scotland purports to be fake news.
Right.
And I think around about the time 1590, King James VI is going to become James I. I think it was published with an idea to suggest that Scotland was a very backward country. This was the sort of evidence they used in the courts of law. So I think it was fake news to make Scotland, as I say, a backward, intellectually, culturally backward country.
I was wondering about this when I knew that this was like an area of research you were interested in, because like my knowledge of witchcraft is basic, but my understanding was it was a lot of the time it was kangaroo courts, kangaroo accusations, and people were, mostly women I think, were killed, with little to no evidence. And I was sort of speculating in my own mind, like, was Scotland more predisposed to accusations of witchcraft, like, versus other sort of European countries at that time, and maybe what would the reasons for that be and stuff like that?
No, I think Scotland may be marginally so, but not greatly so. No, I think the idea that it was the kangaroo courts, sort of heads we win, tails you lose. No, it wasn't like that. No, it wasn't like that. And it wasn't like a Holocaust. It wasn't like the entire villages and towns were being wiped out with witchcraft. No, I mean, it was something like, let's say, between about, or let's say over about, say over two centuries, let's say. Let's say there's 2,000 people executed. Something like that. Now, say, maybe on average about 20 a year. Now, that's a kind of guess. No, not just a guess. On the basis of the evidence of the court records, and making speculation about missing records and so forth. Let's say 20 or less on average a year. Now, I mean, it's 20 too many, but not a huge amount. Now, let's say of those accused, they weren't all executed. I mean, there are various stages in the process where you could get off. Now, for instance, not all those who were arrested, whether the terms can arrested and charged, whether the terms can apply back the straightforward way to history. not all of those who were arrested and charged were tried.
Well,
and not all those that were tried were found guilty.
But presumably the good witches were the ones that were able to get off it, the genuine ones.
No, I mean, clearly, witchcraft was the thing with witchcraft. It wasn't so much that the trials were unfair, because some of the people were found guilty because they were guilty. They were guilty, but only because, in order to be a guilty witch, you didn't have to be a successful witch. It was an offence to purport to be a witch. It was an offence to try to do things with witchcraft. Now, we can't say nobody tried, or that nobody purported to be a witch. There's some, not all that many, but some of them made money from it. I mean, you could fool gullible people by charging money. So some of them were witches.
And what were they doing? Sense, like just trying to make up concoctions? Like...
Yeah. Sometimes people would consult witches to solve their problems and to find things for them, to answer questions of how things went wrong. So
they were the early philosophers.
Yeah, yes, they were. I mean, let's say of those that get sort of sucked into the legal system, and I'm talking about the High Court records and the Privy Council records, official records, those who were, let's say, examined as possible witches. Now let's say that when they would start the process. Now let's say of them, let's say about half of them would get off. Now, you can even come to a trial. Not everyone who was tried would get off, would be found guilty. And the evidence, some things that were thought of as evidence weren't used in actual court trials. I mean, strange though it seems, I think they did their best to discover guilt and innocence in terms of what they thought was appropriate evidence. Now, we see things like the water test. I mean, I suppose that's a kind of popular notion that you were thrown in water, and if you sank, you were innocent, and you drowned, and if you floated, you were guilty. You were guilty. You were executed. Now, the thing is that didn't happen.
It's just a myth, is it?
No, I'm not saying that nobody was thrown into water, because I think people were. In the popular imagination, that was used as a test, but it wasn't used in the Scottish court cases. Now, I only know one, maybe two, there's only one I can think of offhand where there's mention of somebody being thrown into water. That was the Renfrewshire case. But it was it wasn't thrown into water by the court officials. This was done before it got to that level. And the person floated. But you know what they did when did they float or sunk? I can't remember in that case. I think they floated that particular case. But you know what they would do if they sank? They would pull them up and the ropes that were tied around them. I mean, they weren't stupid. I mean, they realised this wouldn't be much of a test if they were going to be innocent and drowned. They were tied with ropes. So, I mean, it did happen that people that
surely you would
blobs and things, but it wasn't officials that did that.
Surely this would just become like hearsay. People would know about this, and then they would go, right, we'll just fucking pretend like you're drowning, and then you get off with this. No,
yeah, but it wasn't a test, and there was people wrote against this test, and they edited a book called The Kirk Seaton in Salem, The History of the Witches of Renfrewshire, and in there's a sermon given by a minister at Salem, and he wrote a book. It was based on a sermon he gave, but I think there must have been either an awful long sermon, or I think the book is in what he wrote. he added to it in reflection, and what he warns people against using superstitious means to discover witches. And he said that's like using the devil's shield against the devil's sword. It's quite a nice idea. And he said among these superstitious practices was throwing people into water. Now, the superstitious notion was that the witches renounced Christ and their baptism to the devil. So rather than be Christians, they became devilians. They renounced their baptism and their allegiance to Christ. They became followers of the devil. And the popular superstitious notion was that since water was the element of baptism, they had rejected their baptism. Thereafter, water would reject them.
Mm-hmm. So
they wouldn't float in water. Now, among the things that this minister said, he said, that's a superstition. It's a whimsical notion. And in any case, even if there was anything to the idea, it would apply only to water that had been sanctified for baptism. It wouldn't be any water.
Mm-hmm.
Water's got to be sanctified for the occasion, so it wouldn't apply to water in general. And this is a superstition. He said, he said that won't give a true account of who it is or isn't. So there was an attempt to be careful. In terms of the women, this is a tricky one, because if you look at the High Court cases, I wrote a piece with Kim Swales, my colleague, on this, on the sexual bias and the law in Scotland. And we looked at the index to the High Court cases over a couple of centuries, and we looked at the nature of the crime and whether it was a male or a female suspect. And the thing is, at least for the High Court, although it's the case that most of the suspects in witchcraft were female, in almost every other case,
male.
So, I mean, it doesn't seem much of an argument to say that was biased against women. The law was biased against women because most witches were female.
When everything else
it was males.
Right.
Now there's maybe a distinction of some sort, and maybe, but the distinction isn't necessarily a bias in the law, and within the witchcraft cases, if you look at the suspects, now there were male and female suspects. Round about, I think from memory, something about 15% were male, something like that. Now, if you look at the suspects coming into the system, that was the sort of ratio, but 15% suspects were male coming in as those accused of witchcraft, so charged with witchcraft, tried for witchcraft, but 15% male, all the way through, but 15%. If you look at those found guilty of witchcraft, but 15% of those found guilty. If you look at those executed, about 15%. So you can't say there's a bias against women within the trial system. I mean, so it's a very complex system. Now, it's clear there were biases and discrimination against women in society, definitely. And I mean, given that the court system was such that all the jury were male, all the legal officials were male. Now, all those giving evidence were male. And in fact, no, that's not quite right. There's even a twist on this. In general, females couldn't give evidence. They could give evidence in exceptional cases, like witchcraft. Women were allowed to give evidence in witchcraft cases because they reckoned if women weren't allowed to give evidence in witchcraft cases, it'd be very difficult to get convictions, given that a lot of the evidence used was witches accusing other witches and saying who was there at the meetings with the devil and other witches. If you couldn't use females,
difficult to corroborate.
Yes, and in terms of the thought of the matter, James VI first wrote a book called Demonology, and this was written before the witchcraft trials, before most of them anyway. And there certainly was a bias against women in the sense that the expectation was that most witches would be female. And this was before the actual trials. And he said that the reason why you would expect most witches to be female was that the devil finds it easier to get on with women than men. He said, and that was shown at the very beginning, in the Garden of Eden, by Eve being deceived by the devil. So there's biases and discrimination and so forth, but it's not clear cut. You know, it doesn't automatically go to a one direction of bias within the legal system.
No, that's interesting stuff. Is like, I think we'll make this the last question. I probably shouldn't even ask it because I might run late, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think it's interesting, like, when you compare how witches were treated under these trials compared to, like, when people in modern day society experiment with, like, a bit of witchcraft, and there doesn't seem to be, if somebody says, well, I'm into that kind of stuff, like that, it's acceptable now.
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult thing to say. I mean, it could well be, and it probably is the case, that although I said that some people were witches in the sense that they dabbled with it, and that was the law. It was a capital offence to purport to be a witch, to dabble in supernatural practices, and also to consult anyone. Now, my very strong suspicion is that most of those who were accused of witchcraft, found guilty, most of them probably didn't even dabble or didn't do anything at all. And ironically, current day witches who imagine that they're involved in practices which have a long historical tradition, might well be the first people to do a lot of these things. Plus, the context in which they're doing it is such, they know that they're not going to be badly tortured. Another thing we didn't make in terms of the evidence, torture was used, maybe not always, but it was used, and with the prospect of torture, people say all sorts of things.
Yeah.
People nowadays who practice in witchcraft, and good luck to them, they don't find they're not going to be tortured.
Good luck to them.
So the whole context is so different that the comparisons, although the name might be the same, witchcraft, it's a different thing altogether.
Aye, use modern day witches. Yes. Got it easy.
Yeah, yes.
I think that's a good place to end it, Hugh. I really appreciate you coming in, and thanks very much for the discussion.
Thank you, Paul. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.